Um, but my name is Kirsten. I am a CRC3 with the CTO, and today we're just going to kind of go over some guidance for amendments and CPRs. This is going to be like a really thorough kind of overview, like start to finish of the process. This is similar to kind of how we onboard new coordinators and things like that. So there might be some things in here that you guys find you already know, which is good. But we're going to go over it, kind of throwing in some tips and tricks to hopefully help you guys be able to get these done more efficiently, thoroughly, that kind of stuff. So do next slide. So what are we going to cover with amendments and CPRs? We're going to kind of go over what they are. How do you know if you need one? How can you submit one quickly, efficiently, in ways that it's going to get approved quick? What happens after you submit it? Will you know right away if it's approved? All those good questions. We're going to kind of go through all of that just so that by the time we're done, hopefully you have a better understanding of all that. And we do just want to mention there is an upcoming Research Connection series with the IRB that they are offering. And it is for a similar topic here, amendments, CPRs, as well as reportable events. And that's taking place on February 13th, so next month. So if you would like even more information, that is an excellent option to attend. Next. Okay, so amendments, what are they? Do I need one? So an amendment is going to be any change or modification to a project that you already have that's IRB approved. This is including changes that are on projects determined to be exempt, but which undergo limited IRB review. Changes have to be submitted and approved before implementation. So say you're submitting an amendment because your records reviewed number is at its limit and you want to be able to review more records for screening. You have to submit the amendment, but you also have to wait until it's approved. So even though the IRB knows, hey, I'm looking to do this, you cannot review any more records until you have that approval letter in your hand, meaning even if it's the date that's listed in the PRO, like, oh, I know it's at meeting today. Doesn't matter. Till it's approved, you can't implement any of the changes. This does not include changes to non-key personnel or contact information. So this can be updated without an amendment in that Update My Project tab. In eBridge, any of us who've worked in children's and had ever worked with IRBnet or anything like that, we know that these used to take full-blown amendments, but that's not the case in eBridge. You can update your study staff without an amendment. And then we just have some examples of things that would need an amendment. So if you were changing your PI, you're increasing or decreasing your enrollment numbers, changing consent forms, recruitment methods, adding in new sites, any of that kind of stuff, all needs to be submitted as an IRB amendment. Next slide. So how do I submit one? You're going to start by going into your study in eBridge and you're going to open a new amendment under your study. So I have a screenshot here. You can see in the corner right under create, those big bold bars there. There is an open a new amendment tab. It's the second from the bottom there. So you're going to start there. Your amendment has to be approved within 90 days of receiving notification. So, your sponsor sends you an email. Here's a protocol amendment. Here's all your documents you need. You have 90 days from the day you receive that email until that amendment needs to be approved. This does include change requests. So, you submit it, the IRB comes back with comments. You have to have all of that done in those 90 days, which is why it's really important to promptly submit any amendments that you get so that you do have time to work out your submission with the IRB. And then you're going to have any updated documents and the IRB SOP available while you're doing this, so that you have all the information you need to complete it. The IRB really prefers tracked changes of all documents. Obviously, it's the easiest way to be able to see what's changed. Summaries of changes for protocols and IBs, a lot of the times, if you ask, sponsors will provide that if they haven't already. And then tracking changes or highlighting updates for recruitment materials or subject-facing materials, things like that, such as patient diaries, ID cards. Making sure those changes are noted is always really helpful. So you can do next slide. So you're going to start when you open your amendment form. This is what you'll start by seeing is your amendment identification. You have to title your amendment. So if it's from an industry sponsor, a lot of the times they have titles already, whether it be like protocol version 5, updated patient recruitment materials, things like that. If you're doing this from an IIT perspective, the best option is to title it with what's being changed. That way it's easy to reference when you're going to look for these documents in case of an audit, things like that. Or if you ever pass this study on to a new coordinator and they go into eBridge, they can look and see exactly what this amendment was without having to kind of dig through the submission. So it's really helpful to title your amendments in ways that make them easily identifiable. And then you're going to list specific language that you want in the approval letter. That's that section 1.2 there. So this is often the same as the title. However, this is auto-populated on your review letter. So make sure that you're titling it appropriately because that they can't change that after the fact. And then who initiated this amendment? Was this something the investigator initiated or was it a sponsor amendment? Also, when did you receive it? Once again, that's where we document that we received that amendment on a certain date, and that's how we're tracking that it is approved within those 90 days of receipt. Next one.
It's this one, right?
Yeah. Yep. So the next section that you're going to see in that amendment form in eBridge here is going to be your amendment details. So what change is being made? You're going to be entering each change that you are proposing individually. And then what is the rationale for this change? So this needs to be regulatory or evidence-based. So you can't just say because the sponsor told me to, or because we want to, there has to be rationale. So updated and protocols and IBs from industry sponsors, they also oftentimes have that track change version where the rationale is provided within the document. If they haven't given you one, you can always ask for one. A lot of the times that's a frequent request that they get from sites because all sites have to provide this information to their IRB. But the IRB does ask that you don't just copy and paste information straight from the summary of changes. Obviously, like I said, you can use it as a reference point here for filling this out, but don't copy and paste. And then where will this change? What will this change impact? So you're going to be checking the document or area that this specific change applies to. So you don't need to list out the sections for the PRO if you're updating, your inclusion exclusion criteria. You're going to click protocol because that'll have changed the protocol, but you're also going to click PRO smart form because that's also listed in the smart form. You don't need to list out the exact section in the smart form as the IRB can see that. Next slide. All right, so then the next, you're listing an amendment details here. For each change that impacts the PRO, just make sure that you're actually making this change in the smart form itself. So, you're saying you're updating this in your inclusion exclusion criteria. For example, you do have to go into the PRO and make those changes. So that's outside of this amendment form. So to do this, you're going to exit or save and exit out of the amendment. And then you're going to enter the PRO tab. So when you're in your amendment workspace, I have a little screenshot here of that bar that's off to the side. You can see it does say edit amendment. That'll take you back into your amendment form. But if you go down a little further there's the view and edit PRO smart form. That's where you'll go in to edit like I said, we can use the inclusion exclusion as an example. Like that's where you would go in to edit that. And you can only access that through your amendment page. So you have to have the amendment open, but you're clicking in through right there. So when you do first open an amendment, so, you open it in eBridge, you start working on it. If you go to click out, there is a delay on our end a lot of the times where you have to give the system a couple minutes to copy the project over. So if you click out of the amendment and you don't have these options, you just got to give your submission a little bit to copy over, and then you will have them available. There's been times where even it kind of catches me off guard for a minute. I'm like, wait, where did my buttons go? But like I said, sometimes the system just has a little bit of a slight delay. But if you give it a little bit, click in, click out kind of thing, you'll be able to access your smart form from there. So every change that you make in the smart form, the PRO, should be reflected in the amendment section 2.1 and vice versa. So if you're listing it in the amendment, it needs to be changed in the PRO. If you're changing the PRO, it has to be listed in the amendment. And then this is also where you're going to be uploading any updated documents. So if it's your ICF, your protocol, your IB that were changed in this amendment, once again, providing track changes to ensure quick review and for your document tracking purposes. Next slide. Okay, so then your amendment details. So this is section 2.2 through 2.5. You have to determine if the subjects will be notified of the changes. If you are unsure, then you are going to be checking with the PI, the sponsor, or the IRB. Any of those people can help you make that decision. It's definitely not something we're guessing on because it's really important that we're making that decision properly. You have to determine if the change requires a reconsent. So if there's any ICF changes that have occurred or any changes that have impact safety or subject participation, then a reconsent should occur. Once again, if you're not sure, IRB is a great resource for that. Just reach out and they can let you know if the change should require a reconsent. So if it does, you're going to provide the details of the reconsent. If your department has done many industry studies, it is nice to have a standard process for how you handle reconsents, as well as templated language for this portion. And I will say, when I say templated language, like obviously use that with caution. Make sure you're tailoring it to this specific situation. You know, sometimes reconsents, you don't have to reconsent immediately. You can kind of reconsent at the next study visit. Whereas if the change is something that's impacting subject safety and you have to bring them in for an extra visit, you know, you just got to make sure you're detailing that standard language. But it is very nice to have templated language as well as a standard process within your office to handle reconsents if they do come up. And then ensure that the changes are not impacting the risk benefit ratio. Most of the time this answer is no, but if it is impacting, then you'll have to explain how it's impacted and how it's going to impact subjects. Next slide. All right, so final checks here. Make sure that all of the changes have been included in the amendment as well as the SMART form. Obviously, we talked about that. Double check your titling information. Make sure that that's labeled how you want it to be. Make sure that all the updated documents are uploaded into the SMART form with track changes. And then finally, you're going to be ready to notify your PI to review and submit. You'll see there's a button right there for that. Obviously, we don't submit the amendments directly ourselves. First, they go to the PI and then they'll submit them to the IRB. Next slide. All right, so what happens after I submit the project? Obviously, now it's in the IRB's hands. You did your portion. So some amendments may require review by multiple committees before the IRB actually gets them. So make sure you know if your study does fall under that category because it can impact your review timelines. I think a lot of the times we think, you know, we hit submit, so now they're reviewing it, we're going to get approval soon, but that's not always how it works. Depending on the changes, there are extra reviews that need to take place. So these are just some examples. Like in children's, you know, there's the HRPP local context review. There's the CTSI TRU. There's safety committees such as radiation safety. There's the emergency medicine resources review. All of these things are committees or reviews that have to take place before the IRB even gets their hands on this submission. So it's important to know that these are coming up. So the HRPP office will review the amendment first to check for completeness and to determine the type of IRB review that your amendment qualifies for. So that's kind of based on risks and proposed changes involved. If you're not sure, once again, that's a great question for the IRB for that specific situation. They can let you know. But IRB review falls under these three categories. So either flex review. So that means that the HRPP staff can approve the amendment and it's not required to be reviewed by the IRB. Projects was qualified to be reviewed via flex are considered like registration projects. Expedited review. So this is done by the IRB chair or a designated reviewer rather than at a convened meeting or at a convened meeting, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's reviewed in full. Next slide.
Okay, we just had a question in the chat. The question is, does the SRC review amendments?
That is a great question that I am actually not 100% positive on. I think it depends.
Does
Do you
anybody else
guys?
on the line happen to know that by chance?
That's a really good question.
I want to confirm is this the Cancer Center's SRC?
Yes.
Thank you, Kelly. Okay. That's out of the purview of the IRB. I'm just gonna chime in here. Please do. Right in. But I would reach out to Jen Bolmer. She probably could give better guidance in regards to what the Cancer Center's SRC process is, especially around amendments.
Yeah, that's a great question though. Okay, so after you have submitted, this is when we start seeing those change requests come in. We see them first during HRPP review and then again during the IRB review. So there's a good chance you may have more than one round of change requests as there's more than one round of review. I think a lot of the times that study teams, if you don't understand that or see it coming, you're kind of like, why am I getting all of these change requests? Like, why didn't they ask me for this the first time? But it's really important to remember that there are different reviews happening. It's not all the same people and it's not all the same committees. So there may be more than one round of change requests. So ensure quick responses to prevent delays in approval. Obviously, they can only keep reviewing and keep moving forward as we give them responses. If you're not sure what is being asked, reach out to the coordinator that requested the change. Their contact information is listed in your eBridge submission. You can even reach out to the general IRB office email, but you can definitely reach out with questions. I don't know what you did, but now it looks weird. It's very zoomed in. I don't know if everybody else on the line sees it that way.
Sorry about that.
No, you're good. You're good. There you go. That's good. Okay. So yeah, once again, if you're not sure, reach out. Any changes requested to an ICF. So if your submission comes back and they're saying you have to make changes in your ICF, just make sure that you get sponsor approval before returning, because even though the IRB is requesting it, we do still have to have the sponsor approve it as well. Once you've made all the changes requested, you need to actually respond to the change requests in eBridge, the little comments. You can just reply back saying updated, things like that, but you can't return the submission until all the change requests are responded to. You'll get that little error message that sends it back to you. And sometimes when you make a change, it'll generate new sections to complete. These also have to be completed before returning. So say in your amendment here, suddenly you're requesting a HIPAA waiver, okay? All of those HIPAA waiver sections that you didn't originally have completed in your PRO are now going to generate, and all of those have to be answered before you can return the submission to the IRB. So just know that that might happen, and even though it looks like you're completing a PRO for the first time, it is part of the amendment and it does need to be completed. After you hit the submit button, the changes will go back to the reviewing team. And then your part is complete for now. Next slide. Okay, so after you've completed all your change requests, any of the committees required have looked at it, either you're going to get approval or you're going to get approved for modifications. So obviously, approval, after you've seen the approval letter, you're ready to implement the changes. Make sure you save a copy and a copy of your submission. If there's updated ICFs, make sure your team is aware of the update and that we're not using old ICFs to consent patients. And then if the protocol or investigator brochure has been updated, just make sure you're distributing that to any pertinent teams. So like pharmacy, the TRU, things like that, just make sure that everyone has a copy of that newly approved protocol. So if you're approved, but with modifications, it's really important to remember, do not proceed with implementing the changes yet. You're not full-blown approved, there's modifications required. Your IRB letter will list any changes that are required in order to receive the full approval. These changes need to be completed and submitted to the IRB. This can include consent changes, PRO changes, changes to documents you've provided, and these will be submitted back through eBridge. So in order to proceed, you need a full approval letter. Depending on the changes, this is often issued within a few days of providing the IRB with the needed changes. So it's not, when you get your approval with modifications, it's not like the end of the world. It doesn't mean that that everything's ruined. It just means that there's a little bit more required. And as long as you get it done quickly and respond quickly, you can still get that approval letter fairly soon. Next slide. Okay, are there any questions so far related to the amendment process?
Nothing in the chat.
Sounds good. Okay,
Is
Then-
there a minimum threshold of some sort that triggers an amendment? So say, for example, if a patient visit is changed in how you're doing the visit, but say not in how much blood you're collecting or whatever, do we still need amendments for those kind of things?
are they new procedures being added?
Yeah, they're changed procedures.
Then yes, you're gonna still need an amendment because that's still a change to your protocol.
If a patient is being seen in the clinic originally and now it's being seen, say, at the TRU, does that need an amendment?
Yes. And if you
That felt like a
don't
phone-
know,
That felt like a phone and IRB question. Yes.
But
Yeah.
why?
It does. Because again, that's a question about resources and location. So we want to make sure then that the appropriate resources have been identified, even though it could be the MCW TRU, but I noticed you said TRU at large. So could it be the PTRU? And then that might also trigger potentially additional reviews by our partners at Children's for their local context, because now we might be seeing a new population potentially. So there's a lot of different aspects that the IRB weighs when the question comes in, what sort of changes, and we'll ask often more questions to really get an assessment of how much is being changed, what is being changed, to help then the team structure that amendment overall so that we have the full information.
Well, that's actually, thanks, and that's a little surprising because the safety profile of the risk has not changed.
In
For
the
the
unique
patient.
environment that we play in here at the Milwaukee County Medical Complex, perhaps physical risk has not changed, but we do have to reassess potentially for privacy and confidentiality and making sure that the appropriate institutions have been made aware of activities that might be happening on their premises.
Thank you.
and this is a great example of if you're not sure, reaching out, because the IRB is able to kind of assess that from a different perspective than what we have clinically when we're seeing patients, and they're able to kind of answer those questions for us. So yeah, this is a great example of if you don't know, shoot the IRB an email and ask them and they'll let you know.
So can I run another scenario? We have time.
Yeah, we have time.
Okay, so
I'm glad I brought my Diet Coke. Yep.
So, for example, I have a protocol in which we say we are going to follow pregnant women and collect samples at certain milestones through the entire pregnancy.
Mhm.
Now, suddenly I was informed that my funding has been cut short and I need to finish off my protocol within, say, 6 months. Now, can I, if I said for per patient, I'm going to collect, say, 5 samples from, month 1 to 9 month or data delivery. I just decide to, because now I have this funding restriction going on, I just collect the last 2 samples and don't collect any of the others per patient. Does that need an amendment?
Yes.
I'm collecting less. At the same, nothing else is changing. The same location, same person, same everything.
Yes, so the IRB is charged to review a human subject research project in accordance with the 8 criteria for approval. And the first criterion is risk to subjects are minimized, and the research is carried out using sound research design. And so the question then becomes less maybe on, well, there's less risk because I'm only collecting 2 samples, for instance.
Mhm.
But now it's the question of, will you be able to still answer the scientific question that you've put forth? And if not, with just those 2 samples, then the IRB has the question of whether or not it's appropriate to still collect those samples and put those subjects at unnecessary risks if you're not able to answer the scientific question at hand.
Thank you.
Yes, the presentation can be found in the box files. You bet.
Okay. All right. We.
Right, you're on.
Perfect. We can go to next slide. Perfect. Okay. So we're going to talk now about continuing progress reports. Obviously, this is separate from amendments. So what are they? They are federally and institutionally required to start with. And it is a time for study teams to basically tell the IRB what has happened since the IRB's previous review and approval. The IRB's job is to make sure that the study still meets all the regulatory criteria for approval, and then they are also making sure that all the procedures and protocols are being followed compliantly, as well as ensures that all staff's up to date on their required trainings. So approval periods can be 1 or 6 years, and there's a number of factors like review type, that kind of stuff, and institutional requirements. So, for example, projects that include children's Wisconsin, things like that. It's going to differentiate your approval periods and how often you need to submit CPRs. Next slide. So how do I do it? Your expiration dates are listed on your main study workspace in eBridge. This is when you need to be renewed by, but I say that with caution because your reminders to start being sent out about 120 days before expiration, but you need to submit at least 90 days before that expiration date. So while you're looking in eBridge and you're like, oh, my study doesn't expire till June, you have to have that submission in by March. So you got to just make sure that you're keeping that in mind when you're looking in eBridge at that expiration date. So the 90 days is so that the IRB has time to review, provide any change requests, you have time to answer, all of that kind of stuff. It may seem like a large amount of time, but it's better to be compliant than to end up reaching expiration. So it is much better to get this stuff done ahead of time rather than have your study lapse while you're in the middle of negotiating anything. Next slide. Okay, so how do I submit one? So when you open a CPR, this is the button for CPRs right above that amendment button that we had looked at earlier. This is going to be the first page that you see. So you're going to start with answering sections 1.1 through 1.8. If you don't know these answers, they are available in eBridge. So say this is a new study that you took over and you're like, wow, I don't know if it's a multi-site project. I don't know if that it has a safety committee. You can look through previous submissions. So your initial PRO has all of this information, as well as if there's previous CPRs, things like that. But even if it's the first one, all of this information is available somewhere in the PRO if you look through it. What you answer here is important as it triggers additional information to populate in the CPR. So just make sure that you're answering these accurately so that your CPR gets reviewed efficiently. Next slide. So sections A1 and B1, we have examples of those down below. You're selecting the status of your study. So just make sure you're picking the correct one. You may need to confirm it with your PI or your study sponsor, but don't guess. Once again, this is our time of year that we're updating the IRB on the status of our project. So just make sure you know the status of the project and don't guess on these. Next one. So request for reactivation, as long as you're submitting this on time, the answer is no. If it is submitted without enough time for the IRB to review and approve, it will lapse. So even though your CPR is in 3 days before your expiration date, that doesn't mean that that you're not going to lapse. It has to be reviewed in that time. The IRB cannot prioritize studies simply because the studies team did not submit on time. So you can't send the IRB a message and be like, hey, I just submitted that CPR, but my study expires in 2 weeks. So can you guys move my study up? That's not how it works. That's why we got the 90-day cutoff and why we get those reminder emails. So if you do realize that a study is going to lapse or that it has, just make sure you're contacting HRPP right away. And if it does lapse, you have to submit a CPR or respond to the changes, anything like that immediately. The IRB can't do anything unless they have a submission to review. So if you realize you're expiring or expired, you have to at least send them something in eBridge as well as contact them. You can't just send them an email because they can't do anything without a submission. Next slide. Okay, so for anyone that has done CPRs, subject accrual is always the bane of your existence, making sure all these numbers match up and making sure it all aligns properly. So the numbers need to be reported since initial approval as well as since last CPR. So they should add up properly. So always double check your math. If they don't add up properly compared to your previous CPR, then you're going to get feedback from the IRB to correct this. And the IRB can't tell you what to correct it to or correct it for you because as the study team, you're the one with the screening logs and the information. So just making sure that you're double checking your math here. So if, last CPR, you reported that you had 10 patients that you had consented, and now you're saying, okay, I consented 3 this year for a total of 14. They're gonna be like, where'd that extra patient come from? So just making sure that your math is correct and that you're reporting accurate information. So this is the reason screening and enrollment logs are so necessary. This information should come directly from those. You should be able to pull up a screening and enrollment log and see who you've screened and who you've enrolled in the last year and be able to also double check your total enrollment for a study. If there have been any patients that were early termed, whether it's by the PI or self-withdrawal, the reason also needs to be reported during CPR. So it's really important to keep this information in your screening and enrollment logs as well. So if you're having patients that are withdrawing consent, if your PI is removing someone because they're not tolerating treatment well, making sure you're documenting all of this information, because in your mind, you're probably like, oh yeah, I'll remember that. But then when it comes time to complete CPR, there's not even a full chance that you're going to be the one completing it. If you hand this study off, the next coordinator needs to know why these patients are no longer on the study. But there is a good chance you'll forget it as well. So just making sure that you're documenting this information in your enrollment logs so that you have it at time of continuing review. You'll also answer questions about if accrual rates are meeting expectations locally as well as project-wide. This information is determined by either the PI or the sponsor. So if the protocol specifies enrollment goals per site, you can also utilize this to make the decision. But if you're not certain, once again, ask your PI or ask your sponsor. Next slide. All right, so then next up.
What quick question? For the numbers to line up properly, the recruitment numbers, is Encore a better tool to use?
If
Does
you're
that do it for you?
I actually don't know if it does it for you, but if your department uses Encore, then yes.
Right.
We just wanted to add up in 5 and 7.
Sure.
And if it's funky, use 14.
Yeah. I mean, it's, there have been so many changes in the last few years in the research arena at MCW for the better.
Yes.
I
Agreed.
think departments and divisions are really missing out if they're not utilizing the full suite that MCW has made available to them. It's really lost. But, sorry, I digress.
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, I know. I'm sorry. Thanks for validating that.
Okay, so next up is going to be section 14. So this is going to be your summary information. So that top one, 14.1 that we can see there, that's the PI's progress report. So this needs to come from your PI. You can't just copy and paste the information that was listed in last year's CPR, even if nothing has changed. Even if you are in data analysis for your project, the PI still needs to be providing yearly updates to the IRB because they're the ones responsible for that communication. Even if their update is the same, you should still be sending them that email to check with them and then giving their, so typically the process we follow is we send the PI an email, you let them know the CPR is going on and that you're requesting the progress report. They have examples here. You can see there's help text in the eBridge CPR that kind of shows what they're looking for. You can even provide those to your PI if you want, but just making sure that that update is coming from them because this is just that once a year requirement to make sure that the PI is communicating with the IRB. The next box down is 14.2. So that one is for multi-site progress reports. That's coming from the sponsor. Sometimes they send them out monthly or yearly in emails, which you can use. But if you don't have one, just make sure you request one prior to submitting your CPR. This is why those 120-day reminders are fabulous because while it's due 90 days before, we all know sometimes it takes a little bit of time to get responses from sponsors, especially if you're looking for multi-site updates like this and stuff. So just making sure that you're requesting that information far enough ahead of time from when your CPR is due so that you have time to get the responses and submit them. Next slide. Okay, so section 15 and 16, this you're going to be updating with any new findings that might affect the study. This is also something that would be coming from the sponsor or the PI. Explaining any changes to the PI's situation or qualifications. If not, then you're putting NA there. And then when completing section 16, if you check yes to any of the options, you need to ensure that the proper documents have been uploaded. So this, you're looking at monitoring reports, QA, QIs, things like that, or the DSMB meeting. So if you're checking yes that any of those happened, just make sure that you're also submitting the reports, the follow-up reports with those so that the IRB is able to see what was determined with those audits.
There was also a comment dropped in the chat, just in case anybody missed it on the line. Kelsey says, Encore does record totals for enrollment versus screen fails. If a patient comes off the study early, you are required to enter the reason for early removal.
Which is fantastic. So that means all of the information that you need for your CPR is consolidated, which who doesn't like that? So
Kelsey. Thank you, Kelsey.
yes, thank you very much. Okay, next slide. Okay. So then your next section is section 17. This is now auto-populated from eBridge. So just ensuring this is your amendment information, sorry. Where they're asking what amendments were submitted in the last year, if any. This is now auto-populated from eBridge. So you're going to be able to see it'll have your amendments listed out, just making sure that they're accurate. And then anything that is changing on the study that has to be submitted as an amendment, you can't, so if you have changes that are coming up at time of CPR, don't try to sneak them in with your CPR. They do have to be submitted as an amendment. So that's not what that tab's for. It's not for including amendments. It's just reporting any that occurred in the last year. And then supporting documents. This is where you're going to upload the currently approved Word version of the ICF. You will upload your protocol deviation log and then provide any reports from the DSMB, monitoring visits, audits, external reviews, all of that fun stuff. If monitoring visit reports report protocol deviations, then those should be included in that deviation log. If they're not in the log, then you have to provide rationale for not being included separately. So just making sure that all of that stuff lines up as well before you're submitting. But once you have all of that stuff uploaded, then you are going to be sending it over to the PI for review and submission. Next slide. So
There's a question.
I know I was trying to, sorry, I saw it pop up.
It says, do you not upload a clean ICF?
Upload.
That was the first bullet there. Yes, you did. Kristen, yes. Yes, you
Yep.
do.
Yeah. Yes, it's just a Word version, but it's a clean ICF.
No track changes.
No,
Send them all.
don't do that. Just here though. Everywhere else do it, just not here. Okay, so tips and tricks. Just remembering that this is for submitting. This is not just a once a year thing. So this information is being collected all year long. So just make sure that you're keeping your screening and enrollment logs up to date, that you're keeping all those documentations that happen with monitoring visit, QAs, QIs, audits, keeping those organized and readily available so that when it comes time for CPR, that you're not spending a majority of your time trying to find everything. Make sure you're keeping in constant communication with your PI so that you know the standing of your study, so that when you're going to do your continuing review, that you're not questioning where everything is and having to collect all the information on study status. And then make sure you know your PRO submission. So if you previously, when you initially applied for this study, say you said you would consent 5 patients, all of a sudden you go to do your continuing review and you're reporting that you consented 7, right? You're gonna have some issues now because you've consented more patients than you had permission to, which is gonna have to be corrected through a reportable event. So staying familiar with your project prevents issues such as incorrect record screening numbers, expiration of your radiation safety, or study team training lapses. Making sure that you know who's on your PRO and what your PRO contains really prevents a lot of issues from coming up at time of CPR.
There was another question about
Yeah.
DS. It was about the clean version. How do you get the clean version? How do we get the clean version?
That should be, I guess, are you asking for CPR? The clean version for CPR should be coming from your submission. So from your PRO, your original submission, your original ICF that was approved, you're just going to be pulling the Word version from section 52. So that document section, and you're going to be re-uploading that for refreshed approval. I hope that answers the question. Okay, next slide. All right. So what happens after I submit? The primary reviewer will look at your CPR submission. There may be changes requested. Your CPR is either going to be reviewed either at a convened meeting or it'll be moved into expedited review. Expedited review is primarily for minimal risk projects that qualify. So this means it's not done by a convened meeting, but instead the project is reviewed by the IRB chair and the designated expedited reviewers. There are some circumstances for greater than minimal risk projects to be reviewed via expedited review. Ultimately, the IRB will decide the appropriate route for review based on the information provided in the CPR submission. So correct information is key because otherwise, if it's inaccurate, especially around subjects participation after it's closed to enrollment, it may result in the need for the IRB to re-review the project under the right regulatory pathway. So it's really important to make sure that we're providing accurate information so that they're able to decide how these are being reviewed. Once again, you have to respond to each change request. If this is related to items that you need sponsor feedback on, it may take longer than expected. That's why that 90-day pre-expiration requirement's in place, but it's why it's also really important to make sure we're following up on any comments that come through so that there's no delay or expiration. Next slide. All right, so after we get through the review, there's 3 options. Obviously, there's these 2 as well as approval. So we're going to go over the not fun options of what can happen post review here. So if the project expires while under IRB review or while you're responding to modifications, or if the project is tabled, what do we do then? All research activities have to stop until approval is reestablished. You don't have an approved project going on at that time. If the project has patients on study, the PI has to email the IRB chair to notify them and then request to continue access to medication. No other activities or data collection can occur. So confirm that your team members and supporting resources are aware that this is expired and that we're pausing participation so that no one else is continuing to perform study-related activities while it's expired. And so then, or if it's suspended or terminated at the time of CPR, this is a rare instance, but it can occur at any point throughout the life of a study, including at CPR. Your investigator has the right to appeal this situation, but if it comes to the IRB's attention that unapproved activities have occurred during the reporting period, or if the information reported shows a significant risk to patients, the IRB can vote to suspend or terminate. Once again, if you're suspended or terminated, there's the option to appeal. If you expire while under review or you're tabled or you have modifications that weren't completed in time, once again, making sure that we get that submission in and that we proceed towards receiving approval. All right, next slide. But the option we're all hoping for here is so you're going to receive an approval letter once it's reviewed, and then you will also receive an updated expiration date. So you'll notice that date in your submission changes, and you have a new approval date. You'll receive a newly stamped ICF. Make sure this is distributed as needed and that the study team members know this is updated. And then make sure you begin preparing for next year's CPR right away, making sure that you're putting, even though we get those automatic reminders, it is a good idea to still put it in your calendar 120 days as well as 90 days before expiration so that we're not relying on those reminders and that we know this is coming up. We know to send out our emails and start collecting our documents, all of that good stuff. So just making sure that we are preparing for the next one. Next slide. Any questions related to the CPR process for me or the IRB?
Yes, Dr. Godet, what can we do?
Quick question.
Yeah.
So like when we submit protocols for initial review
Mhm.
and you have different committees based on the risk and so on and so forth, does a similar mechanism apply for all approving amendments and CPRs as well?
That is a great question. No, they don't go, projects don't go back into, I like to say, like the hopper at that point. The committee that they are assigned to, that committee will continue to review majority of the submissions. Caveat, committee number 6. It is, I liken it to our rapid response committee. They handle a tremendous amount of maybe our treatment use or emergency use requests. So these are urgent requests that have to be turned around on a very quick time frame. We're talking days often. Reportable events and amendments which have significant changes or impacts to a study or maybe subject safety will then often be routed to committee 6 so that they can receive that immediate attention.
Mhm.
And then the IRB can take that action. At that point, they will just temporarily go from their home committee to committee 6. Committee 6 will evaluate it and it'll be returned then to the home committee once that submission has been reviewed, evaluated, and everything has been addressed.
And if the initial approval was like through a real-time IRB
Mhm.
mechanism, but then it continues with the regular committee.
Continues with that
Does it go to
same
committee
committee.
6?
No, no, no. If you received your initial review with committee number 2, you will always be with committee number 2.
No new friends, huh?
No new friends.
Okay, any other questions? Okay,
On the chat?
Nothing
Doesn't
in the
look-
chat. Nothing. I just dropped the box link again. And that one always stays the same. It's been the same one for years too. So it's nice. We have all of our archived presentations in there as well.
Yep, and just a reminder that there is that upcoming Research Connection series with the IRB that does cover what we covered today, obviously, and more, and then reportable events and everything too. That's on February 13th. So if anybody feels like they want to dive in a little further, that is an excellent resource as well.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Everyone.
Thank you,
Thank you, guys.
Kirsten.
Thank you,
Absolutely.
Kristen. Yep.